September 13th, 2014, the Beijing Olympic Green Circuit, site of the very first race in the FIA's latest venture, the Formula E series. After 24 laps of racing, two drivers are now nose to tail for the top two positions. Ahead of them, just one corner remains until the checkered flag. The second place driver, Venturi's Nick Heidfeld, makes a late launch to the inside. The leader quickly moves over to defend, and the rest is history.
And that's an accident for Nick Heidfeld. He has gone off the circuit. The two of them come together in the final corner, which means Lucas Di Grassi is going to take victory in the FIA Formula E race here in Beijing.
It was one of the most egregious displays of driving in recent memory. But who was this late blocker? How did he get here? And how did this affect the legacy of one of the most legendary names in racing? Today, we talk about the Formula E career of Nicolas Prost, an often overlooked driver, but an integral part to the series' history. Nicolas Prost was born on August 18, 1981, in Saint-Chamond, France, to Formula One royalty. His father, Alain Prost, is one of the most well-known names in motorsport. 4 F1 World Drivers' Championships, 51 race wins, and a driving style that earned him the nickname The Professor. Prost is regarded among the greatest Formula One drivers of all time, and at the time of his retirement, held the records for the most wins, podiums, and fastest laps. Despite being the eldest son, Nico's early years weren't spent on the karting circuits and lower formula. In fact, his parents actually discouraged him from building a career in racing. Prost even came to the US to study economics at Columbia University in New York. His racing career didn't really begin until the late age of 22. In 2003, he raced in the French Formula Campus Series, now French F4, and finished 10th in the standings. This kickstarted a career racing in Formula Renault, in which he found mixed success, but began taking victories once he moved up to Spanish Formula 3. In 2008, he won the Euro Series 3000 title after taking 2 victories, and raced in the ill-fated A1 GP Series. But afterwards seemed to switch over to sports car racing for a few years, racing in ELMS, the GT1 World Championship, and the World Endurance Championship, performing pretty well in all categories. Following some behind-the-scenes testing rules, in 2012 he would take part in the Young Drivers Test for the Lotus F1 team in Abu Dhabi, a performance that led into a full test and development driver role for 2013, all the while winning back-to-back Petit Le Mans and the ALMS. On the whole, Prost was making a decent name for himself. Though nowhere near the legendary status of his father, he seemed to be a well-respected and fairly quick driver on his day. In October of 2013, however, his father Alain would team up with Dams founder Jean-Paul Driot to form the Renault E.Dams team, set to compete in the brand new FIA Formula E Championship in September of 2014. And of course, his son Nico would be announced as one of their drivers in June, alongside ex-F1 driver Sebastien Buemi. You could say this was nepotism, but in all honesty, I'd say he was pretty deserving of the seat. Perhaps not the most deserving, but it wasn't like he had done nothing in his racing career. Despite all cars being the exact same for the first season, Renault E.Dams seemed to be one of the strongest teams in preseason testing, with Buemi topping the times table in 4 or 5 days. But Prost was never far behind, setting the second fastest time on day 5. And heading into the maiden weekend in Beijing, Nico had quite a few headlines on him, with Bruno Senna, nephew of Ayrton Senna, being signed to the Mahindra team, meaning that the famous Prost vs Senna rivalry would continue into Formula E. And Prost would make history by becoming Formula E's very first pole winner, taking the top spot by over a tenth over Lucas Di Grassi, just before planting his Renault in the barriers, that was. When the lights went out later that day, Prost pulled away and would be unchallenged through the early safety car, leading every lap until he pulled his Renault in for the car swap pit stop. All went well, and when it cycled out, Prost had a sizable lead on second place Nick Heidfeld. But as the laps ticked down, that gap became smaller and smaller. Up till then, Prost had run a near-perfect race, leading all but one lap. But now, he was facing a challenge that virtually no driver had ever faced before him. His battery was overheating, forcing the car to lose some of its power as the race went on. As the final lap began, Heidfeld's Venturi was right behind. Heidfeld was at the time actually Prost's teammate in the World Endurance Championship for Rebellion, and both desperately wanted to be crowned Formula E's first ever winner. Prost was able to hold him off until the very last straightaway. Heidfeld rode in slipstream and pulled out alongside, too quick for Prost to block. In desperation, the Frenchman threw the car to the left, colliding with the right front tire of the Venturi, the impact collapsing the suspension and sending the German into an uncontrolled spin, sliding over a curb and launching the car into the air. And after completing 3 barrel rolls, Heidfeld came to a stop upside down, allowing Lucas Di Grassi to squeeze through and take the victory. Heidfeld crawled out and immediately ran over to confront Prost. In their post-race interviews, both drivers blamed each other, with Prost stating, quote, "I would not have expected for him to have attempted a suicide move at the end of the race. My victory was stolen." This, of course, was in the heat of the moment and before he'd had a proper look at a replay. It was clear as day that the incident was entirely Prost's fault, and he took to Twitter later that day taking full responsibility and apologizing to Heidfeld, who later accepted. It really wasn't a great look for him though. as he already had skeptics calling him a pay driver. But for Formula E, this was absolutely the best thing that could have come out of that weekend. In all honesty, Prost's last-second decision to destroy Heidfeld may have saved Formula E from bankruptcy. But the funniest part of this whole weekend has to be Lewis Hamilton's response. Hamilton posted on his Instagram, quote, "So I'm trying to keep an eye on other formulas and see clips of Formula E, and this one I had to post. If the FIA don't ban this driver, then I'm disgusted. This has to be some of the most dangerous driving I've ever seen, and this kind of disgraceful driving is unacceptable. I hope Nick Heidfeld is okay, question mark." You know, this post reads as a genuine opinion and valid criticism from a Formula 1 champion. And it would have been, if it hadn't been posted in December of 2017, over 3 years after the crash actually happened. You can't make this up. Lewis deleted the post, but that wasn't before the Formula E social admin roasted the life out of him. And Nick Heidfeld made this amazing reaction video.
Hi Lewis, first thanks of all for your concern, and I've just landed safely. Also, it felt like it was forever. The landing after that crash in Beijing was 3 years ago. Now I've just come from my first race in Hong Kong. And I can assure you, sort of, that since then I've had many races with Nico nearly without any problems.
Anyways, back to Prost. He served a 10-second grid penalty for the next race in Putrajaya for the incident, which would really hurt him as he scored his second pole in a row. Still though, he'd fight up from P11 to score an admirable P4. After running P4 in Puta del Este, he received a drive-through penalty for power over usage, which demoted him to P7, but he'd take his first podium the next race in Buenos Aires. Just over 2 months later, he'd pass Daniel Abt late in the race and hold off Scott Speed to take his first career victory on the streets of Miami, pushing him to the championship lead. He wouldn't hold this though, as a catastrophic P14 in Long Beach and a string of great races by teammate Buemi would seem fall out of the limelight. Still, he closed out the year with 5 straight points finishes to finish P6 in the driver's standings with 1 win and 2 podiums. This, coupled with teammate Buemi's P2 in the standings, would allow Renault E.Dams to claim the first ever Formula E Teams Championship. This first year wasn't bad at all for Prost. Though he was a fair bit behind Buemi, he had the pace to seriously challenge for the title next year. And with manufacturers now allowed to develop their own powertrains, Renault E.Dams were easily the favorites heading into the year, and this would prove to be Prost's best season. Both Renaults started Beijing on the front row, and while Buemi cruised to the win, Prost saw a podium fall away from him after his rear wing collapsed, forcing him to pit with 3 laps left in the race. Mistakes in Putrajaya and Buenos Aires would cost him chances at wins, but he'd still pick up some solid points and take his first podium after Degrassi's disqualification in Mexico. A penalty would drop him out of the points in Long Beach, but this would kickstart a great run to end off the year. He'd have to play wingman to teammate Sebastien Buemi's championship run and give up a podium in Paris, but still came home P4. He'd take another P4 in Berlin, then enter the best weekend of his Formula E career. In Battersea Park, he'd take pole position during the first race and cruise off into the sunset to score his second career Formula E victory. And after qualifying second for the season finale, he'd have a front row seat to the Buemi-Degrassi incident, and once again cruise off unchallenged to take a second consecutive race win. This would allow Prost to jump up to P3 in the standings while Buemi took the championship, both part of Renault E.Dams' second team's title in a row. And a little fact worth mentioning, Prost had one of the best qualifying performances over the course of the season in Formula E history. With an average start of 3.9, these numbers would only be challenged by the incredible Season 5 Nissan 3 years later. So while he was still nowhere near Buemi, he was doing exactly what he needed to do to justify his seat. Unfortunately, he would take a bit of a step back in Season 3. In a year that saw Sebastien Buemi dominate, winning 6 out of the first 8 races, Prost had a much quieter year, though still incredibly consistent. He would start the year with 3 straight P4 finishes. A P5 in Mexico would be the first time he'd outfinished Buemi, but fell back to a P9 next race in Monaco, albeit after a great comeback drive from P19. He'd follow that up with 2 straight P5 finishes, 2 straight P8 finishes, and 2 straight P6 finishes. This included 2 races in New York in which Buemi had to rush off to race Le Mans. In his place was a complete newcomer to Formula E, a name you may recognize in Pierre Gasly. Though Prost outqualified him during the first race, Gasly managed to beat Prost in both races. The first race after converting a P19 to an incredible P7, and the second race after battling up front for a podium and crashing across the line P4. This weekend was a real reality check for Prost, and he ended out the year by retiring from a mechanical problem after starting at the rear of the field. So in the end, this would be the first year Prost would fail to score a podium, let alone a win. His qualifying performance really fell off a cliff this year, but despite this, he was always able to improve his position during the race. His consistency led him to finish P6 in the driver's standings once again, and once again, he was part of the 3rd consecutive team's championship by Renault E.Dams. This, though, he only contributed 35% to, as Sebastien Buemi would have an incredible, record-breaking season, though fall short in the end to Lucas Degrassi to finish P2. Their numbers side by side though really emphasize how much pressure Prost would be under in Season 4. From the get-go though, it was clear that Renault was no longer the standout team on the grid. The first 2 races in Hong Kong, Prost returned 18th and 14th place starts into P9 and P8 finishes respectively, beating Buemi both days. In Marrakesh, he would recover from an early spin to finish P10, but was given a time penalty due to speeding in the pit lane, demoting him to P13. A 10th place in Santiago would be his only point for the next 5 months, as he'd break his suspension in Mexico, have abysmal qualifying and race performances in Punta del Este and Rome, was involved in an opening lap incident in Paris, and qualifying last, not finishing much higher in Berlin. Zurich might have been the race to break the streak, with Prost qualifying 7th and running there late in the race. Unfortunately though, he'd retire from a brake failure. In the first New York race, he'd finally break into Superpole and qualify P3, but slide farther and farther back until he came across the line 10th, taking a single point, and he ended the year with another non-score in P11. So all in all, 0 podiums and just 4 points finishes all year, adding up to a pitiful 8 points, resulted in a P18 finish behind even Tom Dillman, who only ran 3 races. All of the consistency from the year prior, all of the qualifying brilliance he had had earlier in his career was gone by this point. You can argue that Renault E.Dams was nowhere near where they were in years prior, but Buemi had managed 4 podiums and finished P4 in points, resulting in a P5 in the team's table, a catastrophic fall-off from the year prior. Earlier in the year, it had already been announced that Renault would be leaving Formula E, and the E.Dams team instead replaced with a partnership from Nissan. Along with them would be the departure of co-owner Alain Prost, selling all of his stake in the team to Jean-Paul Driot. And although Buemi and Prost's contracts both ran till the end of Season 5, it was to no one's surprise that Prost announced he would be leaving the team just before New York. Initially, he had planned to continue racing in Formula E, and was in talks with several teams for a potential drive after already testing the Gen 2 car behind closed doors. In the end though, he was never able to secure a ride and officially retired from Formula E. So at the end of his career, Prost had scored 3 victories, 3 poles, and 5 podiums in 45 starts. In my honest opinion, I feel like Nico Prost wasn't as bad as we remember. I think his abysmal final season and the fact that he was paired up against maybe the greatest Formula E driver of all time in Buemi, in the peak of his dominance, may have had a bit of an adverse effect on his reputation. And, you know, the Beijing thing. But taking a closer look, Prost was genuinely a really consistent and clean driver. In his entire career, he only failed to finish in 5 races, and over the course of his career, he scored points in 71% of all races entered, a number that jumps up to 85% if we take out that final season. Sure, he wasn't a driver to go out there and take podiums and victories with ease, but he was a quieter driver that would more often than not keep the car out of the barriers and bring it home with a decent amount of points. But we also have to keep in mind that for the first 3 seasons, he was with arguably the best team on the grid, and the second Renault became a bit of a midfielder, Prost fell off a cliff. Outside of Formula E, he's competed in the WEC, finishing 3rd in the 2017 LMP2 category after 4 wins, and for many years competed in the Andros Trophy, which was a French ice racing series. Today, he's still doing the occasional sports car race alongside what looks to be a full drive in the European Endurance Prototype class of the Ultimate Cup, a series he's won 2 titles in. Honestly, it really does seem like he's enjoying his more relaxed racing career nowadays, and at age 43, I can definitely respect that. Anyways, that was it. A look back at the tumultuous tale of Nicolas Prost, a driver overshadowed by the 2 racing legends he was presented with. First, his father, then the incredibly talented Sebastien Buemi. While he showed flashes of brilliance, it was never enough to live up to the expectations. But in my opinion, he was definitely far from the worst driver to be presented with a top-tier ride in Formula E. I mean, he has more wins than Robin Freins, or Daniel Abt, or even Season 1 champion Nelson Piquet Jr. But unfortunately, to most people, he'll always be remembered for that Beijing crash. Let me know what you think of Nico Prost's career, and if your opinion of him changed after watching this video. I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you all for watching, subscribe for more Formula E content, and I'll see you all in the next one.